At the same time, you see the golden era, the golden day of the cowboy in many ways, in this cattle kingdom of open range ranching that is so much part of the American mythology of the West and the Western. Now, the cattle drives originally began in the post-Civil War era, and as you recall, you had a whole lot of cattle that were roaming free in the post-Civil War period because of the chaos of the war itself. Deep in to coin a phrase, deep in the heart of Texas, you had a large amount of cattle country down here where you had cattle roaming the open range, and the chaos of the war, these areas had kind of gone unsupervised. Now, as you can see from these lines up here, these double-checked patterns, these lines are where the railroads are, the major railroad routes. And so in terms of being a business entrepreneur, the cattle kingdom in the day of the cowboy was about taking cattle, the ranchers, on these long drives up to the railheads in towns like Topeka and Abilene and Dodge City, where livestock were loaded onto boxcars, cattle cars, and then shipped back west to Chicago, Cincinnati, St. Louis, etc., to be slaughtered and processed into food and meats for the people of the cities around them. Now, you can see some drawbacks to this model economically. This is as a business model, this is a poor model, and it did not last for a long period of time. You're talking about 20 years. 20 to 25 years was the peak of the cattle kingdom. If I took you from wherever you're sitting out there watching this program, ran you the better part of 1,000 miles up to a railroad, well, a couple things are going to happen. Some of you aren't going to make it and are going to die along the way, which is bad for the cattleman's profit margin. Secondly, those of you that are going to make it, you're going to be pretty tough people. These were pretty tough cattle. The cattle that survived were tough. They were tough, muscular, sinewy, which makes for chewy, thick sole, almost like the fillet of a sole of your shoe kind of meat. And so it depleted from the beef quality you were getting as well. Instead of bringing the cattle to the rails, it made more sense over time to bring the rails to the cattle. So we'll see the cattle drives in the cattle kingdom end when that economic model changes, which is going to produce a lot more profit margins for the cattle, or for the cattlemen, and also a lot less loss in terms of a per pound basis and also in terms of a livestock basis. Also, there's going to be some overgrazing and harsh winters, and the invention of barbed wire will be key because simultaneous with this cattle kingdom expanding, you had the Homestead Act with individual farmers having their agricultural plots. Well, the farmers don't want these ranchers trampling over their property, and so you had property rights and range wars taking place during this time, but the closing of the range and the closing of the frontier had as much to do with barbed wire as it had to do with the railroads establishing itself and making inroads into the West. Now, in terms of problems and challenges in agriculture, west of the 100th meridian, west of roughly Dodge City on the map up here, west of the 100th meridian, you don't necessarily have enough rain on a consistent basis to allow for adequate agriculture in terms of just without assets of modern technology and irrigation, etc. And so the Homestead Act, granting people 160 acres of land, 160 acres was fine to make a living on if you lived in perhaps Iowa or Illinois or Wisconsin or Missouri or Ohio. 160 acres, you couldn't generate enough crop yield to live off of if you lived west of that 100th meridian. And so you had farmers who were going west who were then going to bust out in many ways and not be able to sustain their farming as a viable enterprise. There's also a lack of other resources and an awful lot of isolation if you're beyond the railroads, where the railheads are in many ways. Now, in terms of mining on the frontier, in earlier units we talked about the notion of placer mining, the idea of like pan and shovel miners, pick and shovel miners, panning for gold, the individual prospector. This is the era now when we see that begin to transfer and translate into mining as a corporate model with trends towards consolidation. If you can get some gold and material wealth from the riverbed, the true material wealth is deep down under the rock strata, which is going to involve either quarrying or shaft and tunnel mining, deep mining, blasting, etc., which is going to require a large amount of capital outlays. And there's also minerals we're looking for now beyond gold that the modern industrial economy needs. Copper is in major demand as electrification takes place, even for the telegraph wires during this time. We see iron and iron ore being important. We see bauxite being important. We see aluminum beginning to become important. We see, of course, gold and silver were always important in many ways, but we're seeing a new need for material ores for industrial uses versus just people going out to get gold to try to strike it rich. And this is going to lead towards a trend towards corporate America engaging in mining, often with disastrous economic results, being it strip mining or hydraulic mining where they're using high pressure hoses to blast away cliff faces in order to get to where the ores are, etc. But it's going to become a more corporatized model. Now in 1890, the Department of the Interior declares the frontier to be officially closed. And what the Department of the Interior means by that is they mean that by 1890, they can no longer trace a general loose line which divided, as they saw it, undeveloped and unsettled areas, some areas that had been assimilated and subsumed into the United States. This brings up a new historical epoch, if you will, for Americans in many ways, and it generated a lot of thought. And one of the leading scholars on this area whose ideas had legs, whose ideas carried weight for many, many years afterwards, whether they were true or not, was Frederick Jackson Turner, history professor at the University of Wisconsin. In 1893, he publishes a paper called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And in this work, he argues that the frontier was what made America unique among all nations. This is the emergence of something you've learned about in some of your history classes, the so-called safety valve theory. Turner argues that if there was ever economic downturns or problems in the developed and settled United States, and if there was ever or overpopulation, that the American population could always, like a safety valve, they could escape, they could release through that valve and settle into Western new areas. And Turner says that with the frontier being closed, thus has ended or closed the first great chapter in American history of who we are. Turner argued the frontier is what made us who we are. This is part of this notion of the romance of the frontier and this American exceptionalism. America was a unique nation because the traits of the frontier, the cowboy, strong, silent, self-reliant, ruggedly individualistic, going his own way, these traits were deeply ingrained, Turner argued, and some subsequent historians argued, these traits were deeply ingrained in the American psyche and the American character of who we were and who we are. Even today, the mythology of the cowboy, the rugged cowboy standing alone on the frontier, that still carries, a lot of romance with that today. And so this idea, whether it was true or not, has been a long time established. And as a big idea, Turner's thesis is not quite true. Many historians and scholars since, particularly in the post-1960s, have poked significant holes in this theory, saying that, for instance, the people coming over, it wasn't like you had immigrants, that were pouring over this entire time. Or it wasn't like you had people fleeing the cities, like Chicago and Pittsburgh, and striking out for the frontier when the economy went bad. It was more of a different or separate set of people moving west. And also the idea that the frontier somehow absorbed American economic problems and de-problemed these problems, if you will, is sort of a myth as well. The importance in his idea is not really that it's true, but it's more important that people for a long time thought it was true. And so as scholars, it was accepted as basis for fact for the better part of the 20th century. And that's significant because as we look back at our worldview on who we are and who we were, Turner's words carried great weight in a lot of the thinking and academic logic and conclusions that scholars were making all through the 20th century. Because sometimes, very important point, what's true is not always as important as what we think is true. And we'll see more about that even with the Spanish-American War in some separate lessons in the future. Now, agriculturally, there were some great challenges that we see in terms of the population, not just on the 100th meridian, but all around the Midwest, and particularly in the Deep South with sharecropping. With the frontier being closed, there's challenges in agriculture involving prices and costs and prices. Farmers were finding that the more they